This is me with my Suzuki M109r. I normally post videos of me riding and a few videos of other motorcycle content, but today I'm going to try something different. A few weeks ago my girlfriend asked me where my passion for motorcycles came from and how many bikes I'd had in total. Rather than just say they're amazing and 22, I decided it was a question that needed some thought before I could answer it. It took some time, but today has been the first part of my answer to both questions. But first, let's go way back to the 1970s and build the scene. So I was born in the very early 70s, just north of London. I was born to what I would say was an average family. My father was a breadwinner, a mechanical engineer. My mother was a stay-at-home housewife. I have an older brother and sister. My sister also rides motorcycles. When I was about 2 years old, we moved to an area on the border of southeast London and Kent. And as I grew up, I did what all boys did in that era, spent time with their fathers and watched what they did around the house, garden and garage. My father had a great love of cars and I also grew to appreciate them. But one day, I think when I was about 5 or 6 years old, all of that changed. Next door lived an older couple. Looking back, they were probably in their 40s, but to me they were old. And they had a son. His name was David. He had long black hair and he always wore denim. And he had a motorcycle. He was the only person in my street with a motorcycle. David was a stereotypical 70s biker. Long tangled hair, dirty denim, big boots, scraggly beard. I think we all know the type. Looking back, I think he owned a Kawasaki Z750. And man, did that guy look cool riding his bike. At weekends he would work on his bike. I had no idea what he was doing, but the seat and side panels were always off and he would be in the garden working on it. I used to watch in amazement, and then when the bike was back together, he'd let me sit on the bike. It was fantastic. And that, I believe, was where it all started. My motorcycle obsession began in the back garden when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I guess David was probably in his 20s at the time, and he used to go to work on his motorbike. My mother used to tell me when he was riding past on his bike. I used to look out the window and see him, and at the time I was amazed, but I suppose in reality I just thought, this guy is just so cool, just riding his motorbike. The one thing I never really understood though, was that he needed to do work on that bike every single weekend. Who knows, maybe it was just the 70s, maybe it was just the standard bike building in them days, I don't know. But it was every single weekend. As I said, I believe this was a Z750, an absolutely amazing bike. And to this day, the original Z750s truly are an epic motorcycle. As I grew up, I remained interested in motorbikes. David moved away, but then I discovered TV programmes about motorbikes. For those of you of my age from the UK, you may remember programmes like Kickstart and Junior Kickstart, which were off-road motorcycle programmes. And of course the classic Chips. These kept my interest going for a while, but as I grew older I saw less and less about motorcycles, until I was in my mid-teens. It was around this time that my father told me he used to ride motorcycles, and he shared a photo with me from when he was about 18 years old, learning to ride on what I believe was a 125 BSA Bantam in an old quarry in Kent. I still think this picture is amazing, I still look at it regularly. My interest at that point was reignited, and that light never went out. Even over 40 years later, it still burns brightly. I still look around every time I hear a motorcycle passing, or even when I just see one parked on the street. At about the same time, I bumped into someone I knew from school who I hadn't seen for a while, and he was riding a motorbike. He was riding the best-selling motorbike of all time, globally. The bike that brought motorcycling to the masses. Yep, he was riding the unbelievable Honda C50 Cub. Granted, he was nowhere as cool as David on his Z750, but he had two wheels and was riding. It was at this point I knew I had to get a bike. There was no other option. As I walked and talked to him, he removed his helmet and basically walked the ticking over scooter along. Neither of us noticed a police car pull up behind us, and I think he got a ticket on that day for riding without a helmet. I bet he never did that again. Terry, if you're watching this, let me know if you ever did ride a motorcycle without a crash helmet again. Be interesting to know all these years later. In the town where I live, there were two bike shops. I believe they're actually owned by the same company, but one sold newer bikes and one sold older second-hand bikes. I remember walking past a row of second-hand bikes that were lined up on the pavement and thinking, I'm going to have one of these. But as you can imagine, I was in my mid-teens and didn't have several £100 sitting around to buy a bike. But what they did have was to become my first ever motorbike, in its loosest term. They had a used Honda C70 step through. Not only that, it was only 60 quid. Obviously you don't get a perfect running motorcycle or scooter for £60. This was sold as seen for spares or repair. But the engine and the brakes worked, and what more could you ask for, or even care about? I scraped together the money and bought it and pushed it home. I got it in my garden and started working on it, cleaning, repairing, trying to get rid of the rust. The bike didn't have a valid MOT, so it was considered non-roadworthy. But equipped with the fuel tools I had, some fiberglass sheeting and plenty of David's P38 body filler, I started to work on it. After about 3 weeks of cleaning, repairing, sanding, spraying, and generally having an amazing time, I had the bike looking really good. Well, as good as a Honda C70 can look. And I'd learned to ride it, which is also a bonus. I think during this time, another passion was ignited in me, which was working on motorcycles and creating things from ruins. So in my opinion, the bike was ready. It was good. I got myself some insurance and booked it in for an MOT. This was it. This was the start of my motorcycle journey. The day of the test came, I took the bike to the garage in a nearby town and waited. I sat outside while this old man in a grey jacket went over the whole thing, and it failed the test. All because the lower section of the chain guard was missing. A chain guard. This is a simple metal plate. I managed to get hold of one, and put it on, took the bike back, and it passed. I was good to go. I had my first motorcycle, albeit a step-through moped. And so it began. There was teenage me on this little blue C70 step-through motorcycle, moped, living the dream. What a time to be alive. But things changed quickly. I remember riding past the same bike shop I bought the C70 from, and I saw what was to become my next bike. And this one was a real bike. This one had gears and a clutch, and it wasn't a moped. This, my friends, was a Suzuki GP100. I spoke to the guy in the shop, and considering the C70 was actually looking better than when I bought it, he agreed to take it in part exchange for the newer bike. The only problem, I didn't have the rest of the money. I was still a young teenager. Eventually, I managed to get the money together, and I bought that bike. I now had my first real motorbike, with gears and a clutch. The only problem was, I didn't know how to ride it. I knew the theory, but I'd never ridden a geared motorcycle. So again, I pushed it home. Our garden home was about 60 foot long, which is 20 metres. And I taught myself to ride that bike by going from one end to the other. After a few rounds, I understood clutch control, sort of. I can go from neutral to first to second, but then I ran out of garden. Thankfully, I lived in a very quiet area, and the street had little traffic, so I took the bike out and went up and down the street, then around the block, until I had the hang of it. And then, I was away. Myself and my mate, who had the C50 Cub, he had also upgraded to 100 or a 125 by then. We went all over the place on our bikes. We were doing 120 mile round trips just to eat fish and chips by the sea, driving to places the other side of London just because we could, thinking we were cool, cruising up and down our local high street. It was amazing, the two little teenagers on these little tiny motorbikes. But then, all good things come to an end, and it wasn't amazing. The little GP100 kept having issues. At the time, I didn't have a clue what the problem was, but now I suspect it was probably an issue with the carbs. Sometimes it would run and it was fine, other times it wouldn't start, and it was driving me mad. I kept trying at it, I kept trying to get it to go, but it just wouldn't. So eventually, it had to go. I had to get another bike, and preferably more reliable. So on the good day that it did run, I took it back to the shop and I tried to exchange it for another bike, and it worked. This time, I picked up, well, let's just call it, not a very good bike. It was a Yamaha YB100. You've probably noticed that these are all very small bikes. Well, the reason for that was the UK motorcycle laws back in the 80s were very strict, and the fact that you could only ride up to a certain cc. I think it's all changed now, it's down to brake horsepower, so you could buy a higher booster and have it restricted and that'd be perfectly fine. But back then you couldn't. You had to have up to a 125, was the biggest you could ride before you took your test. So that was why I had these little tiny bikes, as I hadn't taken my motorcycle test. Anyway, back to the Yamaha YB100. This thing was a dog. I hated it. It felt cheap, it felt badly made. It felt like it was one of those fold-up bicycles, and when you was riding it, it could just literally fold in on itself at any moment. The whole bike felt weak and cheaply made. It started to ruin my dream of motorcycles, but I couldn't afford anything else. I got rid of it eventually, and I didn't have a bike for a little while. I've no idea how long I was without a bike, but it wasn't that long. So back to the bike shop I went, and this time the bike that caught my eye was a Honda CM125 Custom. So the CM is just an average bike, and the Custom basically had a bit more chrome and a bit more black painting on it, make it look a bit better. Strangely enough, the guy that owned the original C50 Cub for the start of this story also now owned a CM125. So this was a bigger, more cool looking, ran perfectly in black and chrome. This was the bike that inspired my sister to get into motorcycles. One day she asked me to go with her to a car spare shop, and she drove her car and I rode on the bike. As it was the summer, I was just wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Apparently, in her rearview mirror, this looked so good that it inspired her to go out and get a bike and take her tests. This would have probably been in somewhere in the mid to late 80s. And now, in 2024, she still rides motorbikes. And last time I spoke to her, she had 2 or 3 bikes, including some classics like a GT380. So back to the CM125. I had this bike for a couple of years, and to be fair, it was great. It never had any issues. I think at that point I was sold on Honda's reliability. And because of this, I stuck with Honda for a while. After the CM125, I then bought my first, albeit small, sports bike. I now owned a Honda NS125R in bright red. This was a great bike. I was still a teenager at this point, but I was working now, and I was riding this bike every day, rain or shine. I rode this little 2-stroke 125 everywhere. This really restored my faith in motorcycles. I had my first real accident on this bike, which was totally my fault. It was winter in the UK and I was going to work. And guess what? It was snowing. I'd gone over a place called Shooters Hill, which is a massive hill in southeast London. And I ended up at a roundabout, the Sun and the Sounds roundabout. It's huge. It covers it goes over the top of the M2. As I approached the roundabout, the bike slid in the snow. And I came off the bike and I slid almost all the way around the roundabout, 180 degrees. The bike got a few scratches, the exhaust was snapped, but it didn't stop me. I still went to work. When I got to work, I was perfectly fine. I finished the day at work and I went home. Back in them days, we didn't have the internet. So I had a copy of the M&P catalogue from Wales. M&P's was an amazing motorcycle accessory shop. So from them, I bought a de-restricted Micron exhaust. I bought some aftermarket fairing parts. And I put it all together. And to be fair, it didn't sound that bad. I mean, the exhaust was a little bit tinny, but it didn't sound like a swarm of wasps anymore. And after a little bit of work and some money, I was off again. The bike was running fine. It was at this point I decided to take my bike test. The licensing laws with them were very different. You had to complete part 1, that was riding around road cones in a school playground, and then complete part 2, which was riding in the street. By this time, I had many years of experience riding, and I was riding to the centre of London every day for work. So after previously doing the part 1, I then looked to do part 2. I decided to book a course that covered it. I booked a motorcycle school down in Dungeness in Kent, as I figured there'd be less traffic at the coast in the winter, and I arranged to stay overnight in a bed and breakfast. I was set. So the time came and I rode my little NS125R to the coast in January and did all of their practicing that they wanted me to do. And I was ready to take my test. But then came a couple of issues. After the incident in the snow, I'd broken the exhaust and 2 indicators. We all know I'd put a de-restricted exhaust on there, which obviously didn't comply with UK road standards. And the indicators I'd replaced with these tiny little ones, as they look better than the standard dinner plate size things that you get from Honda. But again, they didn't conform to UK standards. So I couldn't use my bike to take a test. The training school lent me one of theirs, and it was the worst thing I think I've ever ridden in my life. I'd have rather gone back to the Honda C70. This was a Honda CG125. The second issue on the morning of the test was I woke up in my little B&B, opened the curtains to find a nice coating of snow over the whole area. So when speaking to the school, they decided the plan was to ride to the test centre in Ashford, probably about 20 miles away, and see if the examiner was happy for us to take the test. So we rode there, and luckily, as most people know, the bigger towns, the snowfall is a lot less, so Ashford was quite clear of snow. And luckily enough for us as well, the guy agreed that we could take the test. So my test consisted of the examiner telling me what route to take, basically a big loop. So off I went. I did the loop and came back to the centre. Like I said, they didn't have radios, or they didn't follow you in those days. I guess if you got back alive, you did okay. The examiner told me to do the same route again, but this time he would hide and step out to get me to do an emergency stop. So off I went, and after about 5 minutes, I pulled into a long straight road that had no cars parked, no trees, no big walls, nothing. And trying to hide behind a very small lamppost was a rather portly man wearing a high-vis vest. I could see him a mile away. Obviously, I did the emergency stop and was told to go back to the test centre. The examiner asked me 2 questions about the highway code, and that was it. I had my pass certificate in my hand. I had a full UK motorcycle licence. I took that horrendous little CG125 back to the training school, dropped it off, and picked up my NS125 and headed home. 65 miles in the UK in January. It was cold, really cold. At the time, my father lived in an area that was roughly halfway home in a town called Maidstone. I was so cold I decided to stop at his house and get a cup of tea to warm up. When I pulled up at his house, my knees were basically frozen and the bike and I literally fell over. After a cup of tea to warm myself up and pick the bike up, I made the last trip back home without incident. So now I was back home with a full A category licence. Clearly it was time for a new, bigger bike. At this point, I'd really been into films like Easy Rider, Quadrophenia, The Wild One, Hell's Angels on Wheels, and similar sorts of movies. So I knew I didn't want a sports bike or an upright naked type bike. I wanted something different.